In the marble halls of ancient Rome, where emperors commanded legions and senators debated the fate of the world, one woman rewrote the rules of power through scandal, seduction, and savagery. Her name was Valeria Messalina, a name that would become synonymous with depravity so extreme that historians struggled to record her crimes without censorship. Born into the highest echelons of Roman nobility, married to an emperor, and granted unlimited access to the empire's resources, Messalina transformed the imperial palace into a theater of sexual domination and political terror. What you are about to hear is not myth or exaggeration, but a carefully documented account of how absolute power, when fused with insatiable lust, can corrupt beyond recognition. This is the story of an empress who used pleasure as a weapon, humiliation as statecraft, and fear as currency, and nearly brought Rome to its knees in the process. The year was 38 AD, when Valeria Messalina, at barely 15 years old, became the third wife of Claudius, a man 28 years her senior who would soon become Emperor of Rome. She was born into the Valeria gens, one of Rome's most ancient and distinguished patrician families, with bloodlines connecting her to Augustus himself. Her beauty was legendary. Classical historians described her dark eyes, pale skin, and commanding presence that could silence a room. But behind that aristocratic facade lurked something darker, something that even her noble upbringing could not contain. From her earliest years in the imperial household, servants whispered about her unusual appetites and her complete disregard for the moral codes that governed Roman women of her station. When Claudius unexpectedly became emperor in 41 AD, following Caligula's assassination, Messalina found herself thrust into a position of unprecedented power. She was now Augusta, the Empress of Rome, with access to wealth that could purchase entire provinces and influence that extended across the known world. Most empresses before her had used this position to build temples, patronize the arts, or advance their family's political standing. Messalina had other plans. Within months of Claudius's ascension, disturbing reports began circulating through Rome's upper classes. The empress was not simply enjoying the privileges of her station, she was weaponizing them in ways that shocked even Rome's jaded aristocracy. The transformation of the imperial palace began slowly, then accelerated into something unprecedented in Roman history. Messalina started by replacing loyal servants with individuals selected for their discretion and willingness to participate in her schemes. She converted entire wings of the palace into private chambers where the normal rules of Roman society did not apply. Guards were bribed or blackmailed into silence. Senators who might protest were invited to private audiences where they discovered that refusal was not an option. The empress had learned an essential truth about power. In Rome, information was as valuable as gold, and compromising the powerful was the surest way to control them. Historical sources, particularly Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, provide remarkably consistent accounts of Messalina's methods. She would identify men of influence, senators, military commanders, wealthy merchants, and extend invitations that appeared innocent but were anything but. These meetings, held in elaborately decorated rooms lit by hundreds of oil lamps and perfumed with exotic incenses, began with wine and conversation, before descending into scenarios carefully designed to humiliate and compromise her guests. Some men were forced to perform acts while others watched. Some were drugged with substances that lowered inhibitions and erased memory. All were reminded that the empress held their reputations, their careers, and their lives in her hands. The systematic nature of Messalina's activities suggests they were not impulsive acts of lust, but calculated exercises in power. She kept detailed records, according to later testimony, noting who had participated in what activities and under what circumstances. This information became leverage. A senator who might have voted against her interests suddenly found himself supporting her proposals after a quiet reminder of what occurred in the palace. Military commanders who might have questioned her authority discovered that their promotions depended on their cooperation. She had created a network of compromised individuals who dared not oppose her because exposure meant social death in a society that prized virtue and honor above all else. But the palace was not enough for Messalina. According to Pliny the Elder, who lived during this period and likely had access to court records, the empress began venturing into Rome's streets at night, disguised in dark wigs and common clothing. She frequented the city's most notorious brothels, particularly those near the Subura district, Rome's red light area, where prostitutes serviced everyone from sailors to slaves. Ancient sources claim she competed with professional prostitutes, challenging them to see who could service more clients in a single night. Pliny records that she once serviced 25 men in a single evening, though modern historians debate whether this figure is literal or symbolic of her extreme behavior. These nocturnal excursions were not secret. Messalina wanted certain people to know. She wanted Rome's underworld to understand that even an empress was not above entering their domain, and she wanted Rome's elite to know that she moved through all levels of society with impunity. It was psychological warfare on multiple fronts. The common people saw an empress who seemed to reject the stuffy morality of the aristocracy. The aristocracy saw an empress who was untouchable despite behavior that would have destroyed anyone else. And Claudius, frequently portrayed as oblivious by ancient historians, may have known more than he admitted, but found himself trapped by the very power structure that had made him emperor. The empress's behavior escalated throughout the early 40s AD. She began orchestrating elaborate events within the palace that historians struggled to describe without resorting to euphemism. These were not simple orgies. Rome had seen plenty of those under previous emperors. These were theatrical performances designed to break social boundaries and establish new hierarchies. Messalina would arrange scenarios where senators were paired with slaves, where women of noble families were forced to interact with gladiators, where every encounter was calculated to overturn Rome's rigid class structure and prove that under her rule, traditional power meant nothing. Young men from aristocratic families were brought to the palace under various pretexts to discuss appointments, to receive honors, to meet the empress on matters of state. What they encountered was something entirely different. Messalina had surrounded herself with attendants trained in seduction and manipulation. These encounters were not violent in the traditional sense. There were no weapons, no overt threats. Instead, there was wine laced with substances that lowered resistance. There were suggestions that compliance would lead to advancement, and there were subtle reminders that families could be destroyed with a word to the emperor. The psychological coercion was sophisticated and effective, leaving young men traumatized but unable to speak openly about their experiences without destroying their own reputations. Foreign dignitaries arriving in Rome found themselves subject to similar treatment. Envoys from Gaul, Germania, and the eastern provinces came expecting formal receptions and political discussions. Instead, they were ushered into private chambers where the empress received them in ways that violated every diplomatic protocol. These encounters served multiple purposes for Messalina. They demonstrated Roman dominance over subject peoples in the most intimate terms possible. They gathered intelligence that could be used in future negotiations. And they ensured that foreign leaders understood that their relationship with Rome depended on the empress's pleasure in every sense of that word. The systematic nature of these abuses suggests a level of organization that required extensive resources and many willing participants. Messalina employed guards who specialized in discretion, physicians who provided various substances and treatments, and attendants who could read people's weaknesses and exploit them. The palace became a machine for generating leverage and maintaining control through the systematic violation of trust and dignity. Ancient sources describe secret passages connecting various chambers, allowing the empress and her favorites to move unseen through the palace. There were rooms where sounds could not escape, where witnesses could observe without being seen, where every encounter could be documented for future use. The financial cost of maintaining this operation was staggering. Messalina diverted imperial funds to purchase exotic wines, rare drugs imported from Egypt and the East, elaborate decorations, and silence. Senators who discovered irregularities in the treasury were invited to the palace to discuss the matter and emerged either as co-conspirators or broken men. The empress's greed matched her lust. She confiscated estates from families she deemed enemies, rewarding the properties to lovers and allies. She sold appointments and military commissions, turning the empire's administrative system into a personal revenue stream. Claudius signed documents she presented without close examination, trusting his wife or simply too intimidated to challenge her. Historical accounts suggest that Messalina's power grew so extensive that she operated almost as a parallel government. She held her own court where petitioners came seeking favors, knowing that the empress could overrule senators, judges, and even the emperor himself. She granted pardons to criminals in exchange for service, turning Rome's legal system into a joke. She appointed priests to religious positions, inserting her loyalists into institutions that had operated independently for centuries. The traditional Roman power structure, the Senate, the military, the priesthood, found itself increasingly subordinate to a woman who operated through seduction, blackmail, and terror rather than formal authority. The most disturbing aspect of Messalina's reign, according to contemporary sources, was her cult-like following among certain segments of Roman society. She attracted individuals who saw in her license to indulge their darkest impulses without consequence. These followers were not all aristocrats. They came from various social classes, united by their willingness to participate in her schemes and their belief that traditional morality was a prison from which she had freed them. They gathered in secret locations throughout Rome, conducting rituals that mixed sexual excess with religious pageantry. Messalina encouraged this worship, presenting herself as a living goddess who transcended ordinary human limitations. Temples were erected in her honor, though officially dedicated to other deities. Private shrines appeared in the homes of her most devoted followers. Ancient sources describe ceremonies where participants wore masks, engaged in activities forbidden under normal circumstances, and pledged loyalty to the empress above all other authorities. These gatherings were not merely sexual. They incorporated elements of mystery religions popular in Rome at the time, creating a syncretism of pleasure, power, and pseudo-spirituality that was uniquely Messalina's creation. The empress herself sometimes attended these ceremonies disguised, watching her followers' devotion and occasionally revealing her identity to reward the most fervent believers. The historical evidence for these cult activities comes primarily from later sources, particularly Christian writers who saw in Messalina's reign a perfect example of pagan Rome's moral bankruptcy. However, earlier Roman historians like Tacitus also mention mysterious gatherings and hint at religious elements in the empress's activities. Archaeological evidence is limited, as anything directly associated with Messalina was systematically destroyed after her fall. But fragments remain, inscriptions that were partially effaced, foundations of structures that served unclear purposes, and objects discovered in excavations that suggest ritual use of a disturbing nature. Some modern historians have questioned whether these accounts were exaggerated by later writers seeking to demonize Messalina and justify her eventual execution. It is true that Roman historians often embellished sexual scandals for dramatic effect. However, the consistency of multiple independent sources, the specificity of their claims, and the corroborating evidence from contemporary inscriptions and documents suggest a core of truth behind even the most extreme allegations. Messalina's behavior was so shocking that it penetrated the historical record, despite attempts by subsequent emperors to erase her memory completely. The empress's reign of terror extended beyond sexual exploitation to include more conventional forms of political violence. Anyone who threatened her position or refused her demands faced swift and brutal consequences. She orchestrated the executions of numerous senators and aristocrats, using her influence over Claudius to sign death warrants for her enemies. Some victims were accused of conspiracy against the emperor, a charge that was impossible to disprove and always resulted in confiscation of property. Others simply disappeared, their bodies later discovered in the Tiber River or never found at all. The Roman elite lived in constant fear, knowing that a single word from the empress could mean death. Gaius Appius Silanus, a respected senator who had briefly been married to Messalina's mother, became one of her most prominent victims. When he refused the empress's advances, whether from loyalty to her mother or simple self-preservation, Messalina engineered his downfall with remarkable cunning. She convinced Claudius that Silanus was plotting against him by fabricating evidence and coaching witnesses. Silanus was executed in 42 AD, his property seized and his name blackened. The message was clear. Refusing Messalina was not just dangerous, it was fatal. The case of Valerius Asiaticus provides another example of the empress's ruthlessness. Asiaticus was an enormously wealthy senator who owned the famous gardens of Lucullus, one of Rome's most beautiful estates. Messalina coveted these gardens and set out to acquire them by destroying their owner. She accused Asiaticus of adultery with Poppaea Sabina, another powerful woman in Rome, and of plotting to overthrow Claudius. Despite Asiaticus's dignified defense of his honor, Messalina's machinations proved too powerful. Asiaticus was forced to commit suicide in 47 AD, and his gardens immediately became the empress's property. She celebrated her acquisition with a lavish party in the very location where her victim had died. These political murders were frequently intertwined with sexual elements. Victims were sometimes subjected to humiliation before their deaths, forced to participate in degrading acts, their reputations destroyed through carefully spread rumors, their families threatened with similar treatment. Messalina understood that death alone was not always sufficient punishment for her enemies. The destruction of honor, the violation of dignity, and the corruption of reputation were tools she wielded with as much skill as any emperor had wielded military force. She turned assassination into performance art, ensuring that each victim's fall served as a warning to others. The empress's activities were not limited to Rome itself. She extended her influence throughout Italy and into the provinces, appointing governors and officials based on their loyalty to her, rather than their competence or integrity. Provincial administrators who wanted to maintain their positions learned to send gifts and demonstrate their allegiance to Messalina personally. Those who failed to do so found themselves recalled, replaced by men willing to overlook the empress's more questionable demands in exchange for power and enrichment. The imperial bureaucracy became an extension of Messalina's will, and corruption spread like a cancer through the Roman administrative system. Traders and merchants discovered that contracts and permissions depended on the empress's favor. Grain shipments, building permits, and trade licenses all required her approval, which came at a price. Some paid in coin, others in goods, and still others in services better left undescribed. The Roman economy, at least at its highest levels, became subordinate to Messalina's appetites. Wealth flowed to her supporters, while her enemies found themselves frozen out of opportunities regardless of merit. The meritocratic elements that had once made Rome great withered under a regime that valued compliance and corruption over competence and honor. Military appointments fell under similar control. Messalina understood that the army was the true source of imperial power, and she worked to place her creatures in positions of authority. Officers who demonstrated loyalty to her rose rapidly through the ranks. Those who questioned her authority found themselves transferred to undesirable posts on the empire's frontiers, or simply removed from service. The empress hosted private dinners for senior military commanders where pleasure and promotion were linked in ways that would have horrified earlier generations of Roman soldiers. The legendary discipline and honor of Rome's legions were undermined from within as loyalty to the state was gradually replaced by loyalty to individuals, and particularly to the empress herself. This systematic corruption of Roman institutions created vulnerabilities that enemies of the empire could have exploited if they had fully understood the situation. The Parthians to the east, the Germanic tribes to the north, and Britain to the west all remained threats that required competent military and administrative leadership. Messalina's transformation of Rome's government into a vehicle for personal gratification weakened the empire's ability to respond to external challenges. That Rome survived this period relatively intact is testament to the strength of the institutions that previous generations had built. Institutions that even Messalina could not completely destroy despite her best efforts. The financial toll of Messalina's reign was equally devastating. Ancient sources report that the imperial treasury was systematically looted to fund her increasingly elaborate schemes. The cost of maintaining her network of informants, bribing officials, purchasing exotic luxuries, and funding the public spectacles she used to maintain popular support drained resources that should have been invested in infrastructure, military preparedness, and civic improvements. When Claudius occasionally questioned expenditures, Messalina would distract him with shows of affection or engineer crises that required his attention elsewhere. The emperor's general competence in administrative matters makes his apparent blindness to his wife's activities one of history's great puzzles. Some historians have suggested that Claudius was not actually unaware, but rather paralyzed by fear of what would happen if he confronted Messalina directly. She had compromised so many powerful people that moving against her might have triggered a civil war or coup. Her network of spies meant that any plot against her would likely be discovered before it could be executed. And perhaps most importantly, Messalina had given Claudius 2 children, Octavia and Britannicus, whose legitimacy would be questioned if their mother were publicly disgraced. The emperor may have calculated that enduring Messalina's excesses was preferable to the chaos that would result from attempting to stop her. Others have suggested that Claudius's scholarly nature and physical disabilities made him vulnerable to manipulation by a beautiful, assertive young woman who knew exactly how to manage him. Ancient sources portray Claudius as somewhat awkward and bookish, more comfortable with historical research than political intrigue. Messalina may have exploited these weaknesses, presenting herself as the emperor's protector and ally, while conducting her campaigns of seduction and corruption behind his back. The emperor's own historians and advisors may have been too intimidated to tell him the full truth about his wife's activities, leaving him isolated in a bubble of partial information and careful lies. The situation reached its breaking point in the autumn of 48 AD, though the exact sequence of events remains debated by historians. What is certain is that Messalina, emboldened by years of unchecked power and seemingly untouchable, made a catastrophic miscalculation. She fell genuinely in love, perhaps for the first time in her life, with Gaius Silius, a handsome senator who was considered one of the most attractive men in Rome. This was not one of her calculated seductions or political alliances. Ancient sources suggest that Messalina became obsessed with Silius in a way that overcame her normally calculating nature. Silius was already married to a woman named Junia Silana, but Messalina forced a divorce so she could have him for herself. She lavished gifts on Silius, spending with such abandon that even in a city accustomed to imperial excess, people noticed and gossiped. She appeared with him publicly, making no effort to hide their relationship despite still being married to the emperor. Courtiers and officials began to worry that the empress had lost touch with reality, that her years of operating without consequences had made her believe she was truly beyond all law and convention. The final act of Messalina's drama unfolded with a surreal mixture of brazenness and self-destruction. While Claudius was away from Rome at the port of Ostia, overseeing grain shipments, Messalina staged an official wedding ceremony to Silius. Ancient historians disagree on her motivations. Some suggest she planned to overthrow Claudius and place Silius on the throne, with herself continuing to wield real power. Others argue that she was so infatuated that she simply wanted to be truly married to the man she loved, consequences be damned. Still others propose that this was an elaborate religious ceremony connected to the cult of Bacchus, though this explanation seems designed to make sense of what was otherwise incomprehensible behavior. The wedding was celebrated with full traditional rites. A contract was signed before witnesses. Sacrifices were made to the gods. Guests from among Messalina's supporters attended and offered congratulations. The ceremony took place at Silius's villa, decorated with flowers and filled with music. Wine flowed freely. Entertainers performed. For several hours, Messalina apparently convinced herself that this was not treason, but simply another demonstration of her transcendence of normal rules. She had remade Rome's moral landscape so thoroughly that perhaps she believed even bigamy and implied treason were within her powers to normalize. News of the wedding reached Claudius almost immediately through multiple channels. His freedman Narcissus, who had long opposed Messalina but lacked the power to act against her, seized this opportunity. He convinced the emperor that the wedding was not merely a personal insult, but the opening move of a coup d'état. Silius, Narcissus argued, planned to assume the throne with Messalina's army of compromised and corrupted officials supporting him. Whether this was true or merely a convenient narrative is uncertain. What mattered was that Claudius, finally confronted with evidence of his wife's behavior that he could not ignore or rationalize, was forced to act. Claudius returned to Rome immediately, accompanied by the Praetorian Guard whose loyalty Narcissus had secured. The speed and decisiveness of his response suggests that once mobilized, the emperor's authority had not been completely eroded. The Praetorian Guard surrounded Silius's villa, where the wedding celebration continued, now descending into a drunken party as the afternoon wore on. Many of Messalina's supporters, sensing danger, slipped away before the guards arrived. Others were too intoxicated or too confident in their empress's power to flee. The arrests were swift and brutal. Silius was taken into custody without resistance and executed the same day, denied even a show trial. Numerous other attendees at the wedding were also executed immediately, particularly those who had held official positions and whose participation in the ceremony could be construed as treason. The bloodletting extended beyond those present at the villa as Claudius's administration moved to eliminate anyone closely associated with Messalina's network of corrupted officials and compromised aristocrats. In a single day, Rome's political landscape was transformed as years of carefully constructed alliances and leverage evaporated. Messalina herself fled to the gardens of Lucullus, ironically, the same property she had stolen from Valerius Asiaticus. She seems to have finally grasped that her immunity had ended and her life was in immediate danger. According to Tacitus, she attempted to compose a petition for mercy to submit to Claudius, but her usual facility with words failed her. She tried to reach her children, hoping that their presence might soften the emperor's heart. She considered various escape plans, including fleeing to the provinces or seeking sanctuary in a temple, but time had run out. The Praetorian Guard reached the gardens before Messalina could implement any escape plan. Tacitus describes her final moments with surprising detail. She was in the gardens with her mother, Domitia Lepida, who had come despite their estrangement to be with her daughter at the end. The tribune commanding the execution squad was unmoved by Messalina's pleas or her mother's intercession. Messalina reportedly attempted to kill herself but lacked the courage. Her mother urged her to die with dignity rather than be dragged through the streets. In the end, the tribune's sword finished what Messalina could not. She died in 48 AD, at approximately 28 years old, having been empress for 7 years. Her body was given to her mother for burial, a small mercy that Claudius granted despite everything. But her name was not allowed the same dignity. Every inscription bearing her name was chiseled away. Every statue of her was pulled down and destroyed. Her official records were expunged from government archives. The Senate passed a formal damnatio memoriae decree, condemning her memory and forbidding anyone from speaking her name positively. Rome attempted to erase Messalina from history as if her reign of sexual terror and political corruption had never occurred. Yet the erasure was incomplete and ultimately impossible. Too many people knew what had happened. Too many families had lost members to her schemes. Too many officials had been compromised. Too many fortunes had been seized. Too many lives had been destroyed for the memory to simply disappear. Whispers persisted in Rome's streets and Senate chambers. Survivors told their children and grandchildren about the empress, who had turned the palace into a brothel and the empire into her personal playground. Historians like Tacitus, writing decades later, reconstructed her story from official records, personal testimonies, and their own memories of what older relatives had told them. The historical legacy of Messalina is complex and contested. Ancient sources, written by men in a deeply patriarchal society, may have exaggerated her sexual exploits to serve political and moral purposes. Presenting her as an uniquely depraved woman reinforced the idea that female power was dangerous and that women needed to be controlled. Yet the sheer consistency of multiple independent sources, the specific nature of their claims, and the corroborating evidence from inscriptions and archaeological remains suggest that however much embellishment occurred, the core truth was shocking enough. Modern historians have attempted to understand Messalina in context. She lived in a society where women of the imperial family had almost no formal power, but tremendous informal influence. She watched Livia, Augustus's wife, manipulate politics from behind the scenes for decades. She lived through Caligula's reign, where traditional boundaries dissolved and excess became normal. She may have internalized the lesson that in Rome, power flowed to those willing to be most ruthless, most innovative, and most willing to violate taboos. Her tragedy was that she pushed too far, too fast, and alienated too many powerful people who eventually found a way to destroy her. The psychological profile that emerges from ancient sources suggests a person who may have suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as disorders of impulse control, narcissism, and possibly psychopathy. Her apparent inability to feel empathy for her victims, her grandiose self-image, her impulsive decision-making despite obvious dangers, and her manipulation of others without remorse all fit patterns recognized by contemporary psychology. Of course, making psychiatric diagnoses across 2 millennia is speculative at best. What is clear is that Messalina possessed both exceptional intelligence. She maintained her position for 7 years despite behavior that would have destroyed lesser players immediately, and profound moral blindness that prevented her from recognizing boundaries that even Rome's jaded aristocracy considered sacred. The aftermath of Messalina's fall reverberated through Roman society for years. Claudius remarried within a year to his niece Agrippina, who proved to be every bit as ambitious as Messalina, but considerably more politically astute. Agrippina eventually poisoned Claudius and secured the throne for her son Nero, beginning another chapter of imperial dysfunction. But Agrippina's methods were primarily political rather than sexual. She manipulated through traditional means, marriage alliances, political appointments, careful cultivation of supporters. She learned from Messalina's mistakes, understanding that sexual scandal could destroy as easily as it could intimidate. Many of those compromised during Messalina's reign tried to rehabilitate their reputations with varying success. Some managed to serve with distinction under subsequent emperors, their participation in Messalina's excesses quietly forgotten. Others remained tainted by association and found their careers permanently limited. A few seemed broken by their experiences, withdrawing from public life entirely despite possessing the wealth and connections to have been major players. The psychological damage inflicted by Messalina's reign of terror may have been as significant as the political and financial costs. The Roman government itself underwent reforms intended to prevent another Messalina. Administrative procedures were tightened to make it harder for one person to control multiple levers of power. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had proven decisive in both enabling and ending Messalina's reign, was reorganized with new commanders and stricter oversight. Financial controls were implemented to make it more difficult to divert imperial funds without scrutiny. The Senate asserted more independence, having learned the dangers of complete subservience to the imperial family. These reforms were not entirely successful. Rome would endure many more corrupt and dangerous emperors, but they represented attempts to learn from the Messalina catastrophe. Popular culture seized upon Messalina's story with enthusiasm. Within years of her death, her name had become synonymous with female sexual excess and moral depravity. Roman playwrights incorporated thinly veiled references to her in comedies and satires. Graffiti in Pompeii and other cities referenced her name in crude contexts. She became a cautionary tale, a standard by which other women's behavior was measured. To call someone a Messalina was to deliver a devastating insult. This cultural legacy persisted long after the specific details of her reign were forgotten, surviving in various forms through the medieval period and into the Renaissance. Christian writers found in Messalina's story perfect material for their arguments about the moral bankruptcy of pagan Rome. Early Christian texts portrayed her as representative of the corruption that had rotted Rome from within, making the empire vulnerable to God's judgment. Medieval morality plays sometimes featured characters based on her. Renaissance artists depicted her in paintings that combined titillation with moral lessons about the dangers of unchecked lust and ambition. The Empress, who had worked so hard to build a cult around herself, ended up becoming an inverted saint, a figure of worship transformed into a figure of condemnation. The physical spaces associated with Messalina's reign did not survive intact. The Imperial Palace on the Palatine Hill was rebuilt and modified by subsequent emperors, each wanting to erase traces of their predecessors. The specific rooms where Messalina held her gatherings were likely demolished or repurposed. The gardens of Lucullus, where she died, eventually became the property of other imperial family members and lost their association with her. The brothels she frequented in the Subura district continued operating until Rome's eventual decline, but any markers of her visits disappeared. Unlike architectural monuments that preserve the memory of Rome's great emperors, nothing tangible remains that speaks directly to Messalina's presence. Yet archaeologists working in Rome still occasionally make discoveries that hint at the empress's reign. Inscriptions that were partially effaced sometimes bear traces of her name that can be reconstructed using modern techniques. Objects discovered in excavations, jewelry, pottery, coins, sometimes carry marks that connect them to the years of her power. Sections of the Imperial Palace's underground passages, mapped through ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods, reveal a complexity of hidden chambers and secret routes that align with ancient descriptions of Messalina's modifications. These fragments keep her memory alive in the archaeological record, even as her name was meant to be forgotten. The tunnels beneath the Palatine Hill, in particular, have fascinated archaeologists and historians. Ancient sources mention that Messalina had secret passages constructed, allowing her to move through the palace complex unseen. Some of these passages connected to buildings outside the palace proper, enabling her to come and go without being observed by regular guards. Modern excavations have revealed extensive tunnel systems beneath the Palatine, though dating them precisely is difficult. Some sections certainly date to Messalina's era and may have been part of her network of secret routes. Walking through these tunnels today, with their ancient stone walls and echoing passages, it is easy to imagine the Empress moving through them in disguise, heading toward another night of scandal in Rome's darker quarters. The moral questions raised by Messalina's reign remain relevant. How should society respond to individuals who use their power to systematically exploit and abuse others? What mechanisms can prevent someone in a position of ultimate authority from descending into tyranny? How do we balance the need for strong leadership with protections against the abuse of power? These are questions that every society faces, and Messalina's example provides no easy answers. Her reign demonstrates that intelligence, charisma, and political skill do not guarantee moral behavior. Indeed, these qualities can make moral bankruptcy more dangerous rather than less. The victims of Messalina's reign, the young men coerced into service, the aristocrats humiliated and destroyed, the families who lost wealth and status, the officials forced to choose between integrity and survival, deserved justice that history has largely denied them. Ancient sources focus on Messalina herself, treating her victims as supporting characters in her drama rather than as individuals with their own stories. We know the names of some prominent victims, but countless others remain anonymous, their suffering recorded only in vague references to the Empress's various crimes. These forgotten victims remind us that behind every tyrant's legend are real people whose lives were shattered. Some victims did find ways to resist or escape. Ancient sources mention individuals who fled to the provinces when they learned Messalina was taking an interest in them. Others committed suicide before they could be compromised, choosing death over degradation. A few brave souls apparently confronted her directly, though most of these ended badly. The case of Gaius Appius Silenus, who refused her advances and died for it, represents both the possibility and the futility of resistance. Messalina's power was so absolute during her reign that individual courage could achieve nothing beyond preserving personal honor, and even that preservation often came at the cost of one's life. The question of Claudius's culpability remains debated. Was he a victim of his wife's manipulations, a weak man unable to control a stronger personality? Or was he complicit in her crimes, turning a blind eye because her activities served his interests in some way? The historical record suggests a complex answer. Claudius was not stupid. He had written respected histories and managed the empire's administration competently in many areas. Yet he seemed willfully blind to his wife's activities until the very end. Perhaps he feared the consequences of confronting her. Perhaps he benefited from the fear she generated among potential rivals. Perhaps he was simply too focused on other matters to fully grasp what was happening in his own palace. The most likely explanation is some combination of all these factors. After Messalina's execution, Claudius reportedly asked at dinner why the empress had not joined him, either forgetting or temporarily blocking out what had happened. This moment, recorded by multiple sources, has been interpreted as evidence of senility, shock, or deliberate psychological denial. It speaks to the emperor's complicated relationship with his wife and his inability to process her betrayal and destruction. Claudius lived for 6 more years after Messalina's death, remarrying and continuing to rule, but ancient sources suggest he was never quite the same. The realization of what had occurred under his rule, in his palace, with his implicit permission, may have broken something fundamental in the emperor's psyche. The children Messalina left behind, Octavia and Britannicus, faced uncertain fates. Octavia was eventually married to Nero, her stepbrother, through Claudius's remarriage to Agrippina, and was later executed on trumped-up charges of adultery. Britannicus, who would have been Claudius's heir, was poisoned by Nero shortly after Claudius's death. Neither child lived to see adulthood or achieve the power their birth should have granted them. They became casualties of the same Roman political system that their mother had exploited so ruthlessly. The sins of the mother may not have been visited upon the children directly, but being Messalina's offspring offered no protection and may have made them targets for those who feared any revival of her influence. The broader historical significance of Messalina's reign lies in what it revealed about Roman imperial power. The Principate, the system of government established by Augustus, was supposed to preserve Rome's republican traditions while concentrating military and executive power in the emperor. It depended on the emperor and his family behaving with at least nominal respect for tradition and law. Messalina demonstrated what happened when someone in the imperial family decided that respect was optional. She exposed the hollowness at the heart of the Principate. If the emperor's family could not be controlled, and if the emperor himself would not exercise control, then there were no effective checks on their behavior. This revelation had long-term consequences for Roman political thought. Subsequent emperors were more conscious of the need to maintain at least the appearance of moral propriety. They understood that flagrant vice could inspire resistance even from a generally submissive population and bureaucracy. The Senate, having been repeatedly humiliated during Messalina's reign, developed informal mechanisms for resisting imperial excesses without directly challenging the emperor. The Roman system evolved through painful experience, learning that stability required not just concentrated power, but also self-restraint by those wielding that power. Messalina's story has inspired countless artistic works across the centuries. Baroque painters depicted her in dramatic poses, using her as an opportunity to portray scandalous subjects under the guise of historical accuracy. Novelists from the Renaissance onward wrote fictionalized accounts of her reign, usually embellishing even the already sensational ancient sources. Operatic composers found in her story perfect material for dramatic tragedy. Modern films and television series have attempted to portray her, though usually in sanitized forms that couldn't fully capture the disturbing reality documented in historical sources. Each era has remade Messalina according to its own preoccupations and anxieties about female power, sexuality, and morality. The academic study of Messalina has evolved significantly. Early historians tended to accept ancient sources uncritically, repeating their claims without much analysis. 19th and early 20th century scholars began questioning the more extreme allegations, noting that Roman historians had political motivations for demonizing unpopular empresses. More recent scholarship has attempted to strike a balance, acknowledging both that ancient sources were biased and that they contained genuine historical information. Feminist historians have explored how Messalina was treated differently than equally corrupt male rulers, noting that sexual misconduct destroyed empresses while emperors often survived similar scandals. This scholarly evolution reflects broader changes in how we study history, moving from simple narrative to critical analysis of sources and their biases. Archaeological work continues to shed new light on the period. Excavations in Rome uncover inscriptions, buildings, and artifacts that help contextualize the written sources. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains from the period provides information about health, nutrition, and violence that complements literary accounts. Scientific dating techniques allow more precise chronologies to be established. While these methods cannot directly confirm or disprove specific allegations about Messalina's behavior, they create a fuller picture of life in first-century Rome that helps modern scholars evaluate the plausibility of various claims. The archaeological record suggests a society that was indeed as complex, violent, and morally contradictory as the literary sources describe. One of the most intriguing recent developments has been the discovery of private letters and documents from the period through advanced imaging techniques applied to charred scrolls from Herculaneum and other sites. While none of these documents mention Messalina directly, they provide contemporary perspectives on Roman morality, sexuality, and power that help scholars understand how unusual her behavior truly was. These documents reveal that even in a society that tolerated much that would shock modern sensibilities, there were boundaries that were not supposed to be crossed. Messalina's significance lies partly in her willingness to cross every boundary and her temporary success in doing so without immediate consequences. The psychological trauma inflicted on Roman society by Messalina's reign may have been her most lasting legacy. For a generation, Rome's elite lived with the knowledge that traditional values offered no protection, that honor could be weaponized against the honorable, and that the very institutions meant to maintain order could be corrupted into instruments of exploitation. This knowledge did not disappear with Messalina's death. It lingered in the collective memory, making Romans more cynical about their leaders, more suspicious of those in power, and more aware that the civilization they had built was more fragile than they had believed. Later, Roman literature contains numerous references to the Messalina years as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when power was divorced from virtue. The question inevitably arises, could Messalina's reign of terror happen again? The specifics of her situation were unique to Rome in the 1st century AD, but the underlying dynamics are timeless. Any society that concentrates power without adequate checks and balances creates opportunities for abuse. Any culture that prioritizes authority over accountability risks enabling tyrants. Any system that allows individuals to operate above the law invites exploitation. Messalina's story is not just ancient history, it is a warning about what happens when power, secrecy, and moral flexibility combine in one person who lacks empathy or restraint. Modern parallels exist in various forms. Cult leaders who exploit followers sexually and financially while claiming divine authority. Political figures who use their positions to prey on subordinates while maintaining public facades of respectability. Corporate executives who create toxic cultures of abuse hidden behind professional exteriors. The scale and setting differ from ancient Rome, but the fundamental pattern, powerful individuals systematically exploiting those beneath them while evading accountability, remains consistent across time and place. Understanding Messalina's methods and eventual downfall may help modern societies better detect and respond to similar abuses before they become entrenched. The final years of archaeological exploration beneath Rome's streets have revealed chambers and passages that locals have long associated with Messalina's ghost. While supernatural claims can be dismissed as folklore, the emotional impact of these discoveries is real. Standing in spaces where we know terrible things occurred affects people even 2 millennia later. The stones remember, if stones can be said to remember. The walls echo, even if the echoes are only in our minds. The darkness beneath Rome's churches and modern buildings conceals layers of history, some glorious and some horrifying. Messalina's reign belongs firmly in the horrifying category, a reminder that beneath civilization's surface lies the potential for barbarism. The Empress's final moments have been imagined and reimagined countless times by artists, writers, and historians. Did she die with defiance, cursing those who brought her down? Did she die with regret, finally understanding the enormity of what she had done? Did she die in terror, facing the judgment she had inflicted on so many others? Ancient sources provide no definitive answer. Tacitus describes her as confused and unable to articulate her thoughts clearly. This might reflect genuine shock that her immunity had ended, or it might be the historian's way of denying her dignity even in death. What is certain is that her death was swift and violent, ending a life that had been devoted to the pursuit of pleasure and power without regard for consequence or morality. The burial location of Messalina's remains is unknown. Her mother presumably interred her somewhere, but the location was not marked or recorded. In death as in life's end, Messalina was to be forgotten, her bones lying in some unmarked spot while Rome moved on. This anonymity in death stands in stark contrast to the elaborate tombs that housed other members of the imperial family, their names carved in stone for eternity. Messalina's legacy was to be erased completely, as if her 7 years of dominance had been a nightmare from which Rome had finally awakened. Yet erasure proved impossible. Her name survived in the historical record, preserved by writers who wanted future generations to know what had happened. Her story became a lesson, a warning, and a fascination. Each generation rediscovered her and tried to make sense of how such a person could have existed and what her existence meant. For some, she was pure evil. For others, she was a victim of circumstance and limited options. For still others, she was a symbol of female power that threatened male-dominated society and therefore had to be destroyed. The truth likely encompasses elements of all these interpretations. Messalina was a complex person who made choices, terrible choices, within a social system that gave her opportunities for exploitation while denying her legitimate avenues for power. As we conclude this examination of Messalina's reign, certain themes emerge clearly. Power without accountability corrupts absolutely. Intelligence and strategic thinking do not equate to wisdom or morality. Systems that concentrate authority in few hands without robust oversight invite abuse. Societies that value appearance over substance enable wrongdoing to flourish hidden behind respectable facades. And perhaps most disturbingly, humans are capable of extraordinary cruelty when circumstances allow and incentivize such behavior. These lessons transcend the specific historical case of one Roman empress in the 1st century. They apply wherever and whenever power is exercised over others without sufficient restraint. The horrifying bedroom secrets of Rome's most perverted empress were never really secrets at all. They were open knowledge among those close enough to witness them, whispered about throughout the city, documented by historians who wanted to ensure future generations understood what had occurred. What made them horrifying was not just their sexual nature. Rome had seen sexual excess before and would again, but their systematic quality. Messalina turned exploitation into policy, cruelty into entertainment, and corruption into governance. She demonstrated that depravity, when backed by imperial power, could function as a complete system of control. And she proved that such systems, while potentially effective in the short term, ultimately contain the seeds of their own destruction. The empire survived Messalina, though not unchanged. Roman history would continue for centuries, encompassing countless other scandals and tragedies. But those who lived through her reign never forgot. The senators who had been humiliated, the families who had lost loved ones, the officials who had been forced to choose between integrity and survival, all carried memories that shaped their later actions and attitudes. Rome became more cynical, more guarded, and more aware that the values it claimed to honor were more aspirational than actual. This psychological shift may have contributed to the empire's eventual difficulties, as trust in institutions and leaders eroded gradually over generations. The final image we have of Messalina comes from Tacitus, a woman in a garden facing death, unable to complete even the act of suicide, killed by a soldier's blade while her mother stood watching. It is not a dignified end for someone who had wielded such power, but then, little about Messalina's life had been dignified despite her aristocratic birth and imperial position. She had lived as she died, violently, dramatically, ultimately undone by her own excess. In the end, even in Rome, even with imperial authority behind her, there were limits. She found those limits too late to save herself, but her discovery of them perhaps saved Rome from something even worse. Today, visitors to Rome walk over the ground where Messalina once reigned. The Palatine Hill, the Forum, the Subura district, all have been built and rebuilt, destroyed and reconstructed countless times over 2 millennia. Nothing visible connects these spaces to the empress who once dominated them. Yet history has layers invisible to the casual eye. Beneath the modern city lie the stones of Imperial Rome. Beneath those stones lie older structures, and beneath all of it lie the stories. Some recorded, some forgotten, some deliberately suppressed. Messalina's story refused to stay suppressed. It clawed its way back into historical consciousness, demanding to be remembered not as inspiration, but as warning. Beware power unchecked. Beware charm without conscience. Beware intelligence divorced from empathy. These warnings echo still, transmitted across centuries, relevant as ever. As evening falls over Rome, as shadows lengthen across ancient ruins, locals still speak of ghosts in the underground passages. They tell stories of a woman in ancient dress, glimpsed briefly before vanishing. They mention sounds echoing from empty chambers, footsteps, voices, something that might be laughter or might be weeping. Rational explanations exist for all these phenomena. Tricks of light, wind through stone channels, the power of suggestion. Yet the stories persist because Messalina's reign left a scar on Rome's collective psyche that has never fully healed. She represents something that civilization tries to forget, but cannot: the knowledge that beneath the veneer of culture and law, barbarism waits. Her memory serves a purpose even now, reminding us that eternal vigilance is necessary to prevent the strong from preying upon the weak, that moral boundaries exist for good reason, and that forgetting history truly does doom us to repeat it. The horrifying secrets of Rome's most perverted empress are no longer secret. They stand as historical fact, documented warning, and eternal reminder of where unchecked power and moral bankruptcy inevitably lead.